honored to have with us tonight Mr. Chang rae. Chang rae is the author of 5 novels: Native Speaker, A Juster Life, Aloft, The Surrendered, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and his latest, On Such a Full Sea, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. He has also won numerous other awards, including the Hemingway Foundation Pen Award and too many others to list. He is currently the director of Princeton's Creative Writing Program. And sitting next to him is tonight's moderator, Edward Wong, who is the Beijing bureau chief of the New York Times. He's also a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's part of a group of reporters from the Baghdad Bureau named as finalists for their coverage of the Iraq War from 2003 to 2007. He also often writes on travel in the Himalayas and Central Asian mountain ranges. We're very fortunate to have him with us tonight.
Is it on? Looks like it's on. Okay. All right. So I'll just start with a very short anecdote about my own first encounter with Chang rae, which was when I was an intern in 1998 at the New York Times. That summer, I wanted to read books about New York, and so one of the books I read that summer was Native Speaker, which is his first novel, and it was at a time when I really wanted to get to know more about the immigrant issues and immigrant communities in New York because I was interested in covering it, and I thought this book was an amazing portrait of the New York that I really wanted to immerse myself in. And I think, my wife and I were talking as we were coming over here about how a lot of Asian Americans, our age, probably have this book on their shelves because it's
our age.
Our age. It's kind of a sort of seminal work about the immigrant experience and especially the urban immigrant experience.
Well, it's 20 years old now, I guess.
Right.
It came out in 1995.
Right. Hopefully other younger generations have them on their shelves too, I assume.
You don't have to say.
So anyways, his latest book, I think, is a departure from that, and it's interesting because China is a large part of the book, and earlier today I was at the Chinese Prime Minister's press conference, and he said that he wanted to carry on the war against pollution. He said they haven't done enough, and that China really needs to push for the war against pollution. Now, in your book, in your last book, On Such a Full Sea, the future that you envision is one in which China and other countries lose the war on pollution. So, can you tell us a little bit about why you see this as being the future of the world, or is this a probable future in your?
Yeah, it's not just China; it's really everyone in the book. It's a society. The book is set, some vague number of years ahead. About 150, 200 years. I'm not that specific about it, but I am fairly specific about the kinds of implications for the people in the society, which is that they all suffer from a certain kind of inevitable disease, which they call C, which is of course something that's just sort of lurking out there mysteriously. They can't really quite get hold of it. They can't really address it, and obviously that comes from the violation of the environment. They're always talking about being careful about the things that you eat, and the water that you drink. And one of the conceits of the book is that there's a production facility called Beemore in the former Baltimore, and this production facility is a facility that provides pristine fishes and vegetables for an elite class of peoples. And the very fact of its existence is that because everything outside is too poisoned and too ruined to trust. So it's really actually one of the things that is part of the conceit of the book and drives the book. I don't get into environmental issues very much. I think there was some guy who kept writing me every week after the book came out and said, can you just come out and say this is a sci-fi novel? He wanted to I don't know, he must have a trademark on it or something. And it is, there's climate anxiety, but it's not I guess, that geeky about it. It's really just more about a certain kind of, almost a psychic condition of feeling beleaguered. And today we were just walking around. I bought my first mask here, which I kind of like. But then I was noting that the mask itself smelled sort of chemically. Like maybe the mask is actually worse for you.
It's produced in China. It's probably made in China. And then I read that you were originally going to write a novel about China, but then you were taking the train to Amtrak, presumably past Baltimore, and sort of decided to set it there. Why did you originally decide to, in your original conception of the novel, why did you want to set a book in China? And then can you tell us a little bit about the research that you did? You came to China on one or more trips to do some research, and tell us about that.
Yeah, my original idea was to write a kind of social fabric novel about Chinese factory workers. And so in about 2011 or so, I went to Shenzhen. Now my sister lives in Hong Kong, so it was an easy trip. And sort of finagled my way into a factory. And it was really a really fascinating visit for me. And I hadn't been to a factory, and I had all these preconceptions about what I would see. And it actually wasn't so horrible. I don't know if people have gone to that area where, that's where all the factories are, and there are they're not really factories so much, they're settlements. And this particular settlement factory that I went to was a facility that produced tiny electrical motors, the kind that drive a DVD tray or a side view mirror. So it wasn't a big, huge industrial complex. And it was really more like a campus, but like a really grubby one, kind of run down. And there was nothing aesthetically pleasing about it.
It wasn't like Princeton.
No. Princeton, every blade of grass is accounted for. It's a little creepy. But,
that's another dystopian novel.
Well, dystopias are always about utopias, of course. They're wrong. But this particular place was, it was exactly what I needed for the book that I wanted to write. It had a little health center. It had a basketball hoop that was rusty. It had the dining hall. It had the dormitories, of course, which housed 8 people in one little room, 4 bunks, 4 high. They had a little hot plate and a little, like a little live plant there. So people were trying to make a life out of it, obviously, and choosing to be there. And of course, most of the workers were younger women. And I was all set to write that novel. I went back to my desk in Princeton and started to write, but I felt as if, and this is, I think, I gotta blame you guys, journalists who've done such a great job in helping me do my initial research about all the things that were going on in China. And I guess I'd always been, in the last 5 to 7 years, someone who, particularly as an American, I think, someone who had a lot of interest in China, both for all the awesome things that were happening and also the kind of dread about China, about its power, about its environment, about its, all the things that make China special and noticeable. So I got back to my desk and I felt as if I was writing, the writing was fine, but I think I was writing just basically what you guys were writing, which is I wasn't adding anything to that story, in my view. I didn't want to just report on it, because when you're writing a novel, it's not about just representation. Of course, when you're writing a great journalistic piece, it's not that either. But the novel, especially something that needs to be sustained for that many pages, you really need other kinds of angles. You need other kinds of approaches to the material to make it come alive in a way that is unlikely, but is still, obviously truthful, and maybe one most beautiful. So I guess I had to admit to myself that stuff wasn't happening for whatever reason. I just wasn't imagining the characters right. I've been so inspired by certain novels like Zola Germinal. I don't know if any of you read that novel by Emile Zola. It's a great novel about coal miners in town in 19th century France, and their struggles, and their battles against the owners, and the degradation that they suffered, and I was going to do all that, but I guess I just didn't again have that special fresh angle on my material, so I kind of put it away, kind of depressed, because I'd done all this work and I was still excited about it, and that's when I took this train ride from New York to DC. And for those of you who have not been on that train, it's the regular train that goes every day, many times a day. And I'd been on that train because I'd grown up in the New York area. I've been on that train, I'm 49 now, for probably 45 years of my life, going back and forth periodically. And for 45 years, I'd always seen, as you roll into Baltimore, Penn Station, and the east side of Baltimore, which has always been, since I can remember as a little kid, a forlorn neighborhood, a neighborhood that is your classic American ghetto, right? And the reasons for it are myriad, very complicated: race, racism, economic decline, post-industrial stuff, all that kind of stuff. But so that's the kind of neighborhood it was, and I was looking at this neighborhood and not thinking at all about writing about it. I just got angry and frustrated as a citizen. I said, I can't believe I've been seeing this neighborhood for almost, for probably 4 decades, in various states of neglect, disrepair, hope a little bit. And the current iteration that I saw was that it was boarded up. These are, if you can imagine, very, very modestly 20th century, modest row houses, but they had been not burnt out, just boarded up with plywood, so that, and the streets completely cleared of anything, so that no one was supposed to live there anymore. They weren't knocking them down, but it was just clearly, absolutely cleared out of people. It's like a neutron bomb went off. The buildings are standing, but the people are all gone. And I thought to myself, what a waste. We need so much affordable housing in our cities, Baltimore especially. And I said, why don't we just invite like a environmentally ruined village in China? People can't live there. 50,000 people. Let's bring them over here. Let them have it, right? Let's see what they do with it. They got to do something good with it. Who knows what they'll do. And I kept just sort of tossing that idea about it, and I thought, gee, that would be kind of a fun idea if kind of an immigration story en masse. Usually immigration stories like my family and this community, but to bring everyone over at once in a kind of engineered way, with a real purpose, right? A mission to revitalize. And I thought, well, of course that's not going to work. No one's going to allow that, even if people needed it. But then I just kept rolling about the idea, and I thought, well, maybe in the future, in a very different future, when America might need a certain kind of assistance, a certain kind of revitalization, maybe all these forlorn urban areas were still 100 years, 50, 200 years, that's still a problem, still, something that needed to be addressed. Maybe that would happen. So I said, okay, I'll set the book in the future. But then, of course, once you do that, you have to talk about the rest of that context. And so that's how this book happened. But I still took, I guess, a lot of the research I did from my Shenzhen trip, and not the details of that visit, but I guess the feeling, the ethos of those workers, and the sense of community that they had, and really this novel started out as a novel about community, but a certain kind of community. But then it became, quite a bit larger.
Was it difficult to make that decision, set a novel in the future? It's a sort of type of setting you haven't used before in your writing.
Yeah, I mean, I really, when I actually wrote a few sentences in and realized what I was doing, I said, I really did say to myself, are you fucking crazy? You know, because I never imagined myself writing such a book. I mean, not that I'm against it, and I read science fiction as a kid, and I wouldn't say I'm the hugest fan, but I enjoyed it. But I never imagined myself doing such a thing. But again, I thought, I'm not really writing a science fiction. I'm not writing a dystopian novel. I'm just writing about people in a slightly different context. And I realized that and trying to describe that context to help you understand the people. And I realized I've been doing that all my career. Immigrant novels, I think I've said this, are sort of dystopian novels. They're dystopian novels because, not from someone else's point of view, because the society works for the mainstream. But for the immigrant, for the newcomer, the world is completely upside down, right? Nothing works, you're not understood, you're not seen in the way that you believe you're seen or should be seen. So it didn't actually, once I started executing the novel, it didn't feel that different, even though the outer surface of it seems profoundly different. But to me it's not.
Right. And then, even though in your mind, you said, I'm not writing a sci-fi novel or a dystopian novel, were there certain conventions or tropes of novels set in the future that you decided to adopt or play with as you were writing this?
Well, I wanted to try to, I'm a fairly experienced reader, so and someone who loves reading. I think most of you are probably people who love reading, and I love certain kinds of stories, right? And so that, I think a lot of dystopian novels, the science fiction novels, also are adventure novels, novels of quest, novels of a certain, and then also, I was interested in a certain kind of novel of coming of age, and then also of course, the modality of fable making or myth making, and I felt like all those things, various kinds of storytelling would fit nicely with this novel. Mostly because, again, I wasn't going to be geeky about the science fiction part. I wasn't going to try to give people a manual of that time. This is not that book. It's really more a feeling about a certain kind of, again, altered context that I hoped would very much be aligned with and point to our present context.
And it seems that in the recent interview you did with the Times Magazine about the types of books you've read recently, or the books you've read, that you in the end have embraced the idea that this is a dystopian novel, because you cited it, I think, along with in the context of classic dystopian novels, as well as more recent works by Cormac McCarthy or Kazuo Ishiguro. So that's something that you see this novel as part of that continuum.
Well, again, I think those books are interesting because they're not particularly, they're not traditional science fiction novels. And Ishiguro's book especially, and I read that when it came out, and I was trying not to think about any of those other books, but it's, again, with all of his work, it's sort of dreamy, and we don't quite know, it's murky, we don't quite know the circumstances that we're in, and he plays with that. And if you think of it, it's an Ishiguro novel more than anything else. And I hope, I suppose, all my novels are a little bit, have a lot of me in them. And that's why we write, right? And that's why we read particular writers. So, and McCarthy too. I mean, if you think about the McCarthy novel, sure, it's an apocalyptic landscape, there are marauding gangs, all this graphic violence. But it has the same kind of sense of, daunted adventure that a lot of his Western novels have, with, extreme violence, extreme depravity, a certain kind of aestheticism of bloodlust. That again, it's more a McCarthy novel than anything else, right? And we talk about novels. It's easier to talk about novels, particularly reviewers and blurbs, and even on the book jacket, as a certain way. But really, if a novel is worth anything, it should defy those things. Even not 100%, but it should always be a little slippery, I think. Because really the proof is in, ultimately the writing. And that's what the proof is.
wanted to just touch on some of the novels you wrote right before this, and a couple of them bring, they're all about sort of immigrant identities, but after Native Speaker you brought in a lot more certain aspects of Asian history into some of your novels, especially wars that took place in Asia, the Japanese War, the Korean War. And I'm wondering at what point did that become attractive to you, sort of bringing in these very profound moments in Asian history and how they impacted your characters and why you decided to go in that direction?
Well, probably just the initial kernel was a personal reason, you know, and with A Gesture Life, which is about this fellow who has an experience with so-called comfort women, Korean comfort women. It was because I had, as a Korean American, I had never heard about what had happened to these women, not just the Korean women, of course, but many Asian women and some Dutch women. And I was shocked that I hadn't known about it, and that's partly why I decided to just look into it in terms of my research, and also my grandmother was just that generation, and so it brought it home to me in a way. And I hate to say, you don't want to feel like you're responsible. You feel responsible to write about something like a responsibility, but it's hard to tease it out. Is it my personal passion, or is it a sense of a certain kind of political justice that who knows? But that's where that book came out of, and then the Surrendered, which is more centered in the Korean War. That book also was catalyzed by an experience my father had during the war, which I learned about many years after. I suppose it took me to being adult to find out what had happened during it, to him during the war, and that after that, the war kind of haunted me in a way, more through him, and to think about all the kinds of experiences that very normal people, quote unquote, like him, had all throughout history, and particularly in that conflict. And probably the third thing is just as a kid I was kind of obsessed with, maybe as a lot of boys are, with war. I watched war movies. I had those soldiers, and I played with guns all the time, and it's just kind of talk about in the air and the environment, right? It's kind of martial instinct, and also celebration in the movies, and so I think I was working through a lot of that stuff too, trying to maybe exercise a lot of that stuff, and then
I think one of the interesting things about sort of some of the conversation that goes on sort of within sort of Asian American sort of political activists, writers, is how much you bring in that Asian history into when you talk about things, because then there's this one stand where you insist on saying, our issues are American issues, and so we don't want to be seen as the other, and we shouldn't be contextualized within Asian history. And yet there are a lot of people who say, Asian history is sort of what forms us, and so you can't avoid addressing it. I was wondering if this is a question that you've thought about, especially when you were writing these works.
Well, I think I've been of both minds, but I guess when it comes down to the the creative moment, it's hard to say. I mean, I suppose that again, it felt both beyond me and very personal at the same time. And I guess that's as much as I can say about it. I don't write novels because I have certain political agendas. I have political opinions and agendas somehow in print my work, but I try to keep that stuff to the side and try to look at momentary and isolated human interactions, and hope that they're not designed or engineered to be primarily didactic or a certain kind of advocacy. I hope that the books do have some kind of political, that they make some observations that might feel truthful or expose something about what happened back then or with people now. but I don't start out that way. And if I did start out that way, I should just write op-ed pieces, right? That's just more direct that way, and I have. but you know, these are fictions, and you know, again, I'm attracted. I've always been attracted to them both for the aspect of storytelling, but also you know, the lyrical side of it. It is about the writing. It is about the language, which it doesn't transcend politics. It's just a different thing.
When you started looking more into the comfort women issue, did you get more politicized over that issue, or what was your take?
It did, and it actually tripped me up a little bit because people heard that I was writing this story, and then I started feeling again a little bit of responsibility, like I can't mess this up, or I have to be careful about what I represent and how I represent it, and I think that's the death of a good fiction, to tell you the truth. I felt, again, not that, all these other voices started entering my head about any particular little moment, any kind of characterization. So, and you really can't render things that way. And that's why I also ended up not writing a certain novel. I was going to write a novel that was from the point of view of these women, and was really centered in their experience. But I realized after about writing 200 pages of this that, again, I hadn't really added anything to the public record in what I'd written. Again, it wasn't bad writing, it just, you could get what I'd given you just by reading oral testimonies from these women. So what am I doing? And that turned me to the idea that perhaps I should tell the story that hadn't been told, or that I hadn't come across or encountered in my research, which was the perspective of one of the men, one of the perpetrators, if you will, and to think about their, the career of their kind of consciousness about that moment, and then maybe how that moment had clarified or brought out something about their existence. And so it ended up being, about this medic who had helped some of these women.
I just wanted to open up to questions and see if we can take the dialogue over to the audience side now.
Yeah. You got a question? Or
I'm just curious, you seem, for a writer, really well adjusted and mentally stable.
You should have seen me last night.
I'm just curious, over your career, how you've dealt with pressure and expectation, and especially your first book was really well received. I wonder the evolution from that to now, how you've dealt with that kind of external forces.
Well, any writer who's had, somewhat of a sustained career would be lying if he told you, or she told you, that they weren't aware of how people will read your book. And I'm in the very fortunate position of knowing that when I publish a book, at least people will read it initially. It'll get reviewed poorly or well or whatever, but it will get some attention. So that is part of it, but I think, even from the first book, and we were talking about today a little bit, Murakami's book about writing novels like, long distance running. And novel writing is so difficult for me. It always has been. And every single book of mine, there have been clear points at which I felt that I should give it up. Each one of my published novels, I was absolutely sure I should quit. And that's just how it is. So the tension and the anxiety and the kind of agony and the hopes that one has are so, they're so ornate that after a while you end up forgetting about everybody else. I think at the start you think, when I was starting this book, I thought, oh God, what are people going to say about this book? But once I get into the book, its problems are complicated enough, or maybe I make them complicated enough that you're just too preoccupied. And I think that's one of the saving graces of writing novels. And I think another thing for me is that, you know, no one gets into this game in the end, to make money or to be famous or anything like that. I mean, we just, you know, the writers that I know and that I really admire and understand and connect with, they're all just people who are so serious about their work, ultimately. Yeah, sure, maybe they drink too much sometimes, or they're not great with, you know, their relationships, or maybe they're not the most well-adjusted people, but they have a real loyalty to the work. And I think if you have that, all that other stuff begins to fall away. And that's what I tell my students who want to write, is like, you know, it doesn't really matter if you write well. That's not actually the thing. A lot of people write well. It's, will you continue to write when you think you're not writing well? And will you push through? And that kind of attention is, again, it's while you're building a world, it just allows you to forget the whole thing. And that's why I write sometimes, just forget the world, you know, everything else.
I have a follow-up question on Ware's question, which is, you just said that, you know, you talked about how difficult it is, and about the thoughts of giving up on a work, and I have to say that's not the most contrarian remark. Like, probably everyone who sat in this seat has said similar things. Have you ever met a novelist who said, or a short story writer who said it's easy, that it comes easy for them, that it just spills out and then they can walk away from it?
Once I did. I was so suspicious, but but I guess so. Some writers, though, I don't feel as if, and maybe they're not the writers I respect the most. I do feel like they have less trouble. I don't know, maybe because they have a thing that they do, or a certain kind of, you know, shtick, or a certain kind of structure that they're following all the time, consciously or unconsciously. But I think the writers that I like most, they don't really know what the hell's going to happen. They don't really know what kind of lingual stamp they're going to put on things. It's just, you know, it's all kind of improvised, purposefully, but it's improvised.
Hi, oh my gosh, I'm a huge fan of yours. I've read all your books. I love all your books. Oh my gosh. But just like, I have a really specific question about this book, which is like, I was wondering what was important to you about like making Fan pregnant, because I was kind of surprised. Like, I thought maybe at the end she would give birth, and I was surprised.
Is this a spoiler here?
She didn't, so it's not a spoiler. But anyhow, I was like, because I thought there would be more about her maybe bonding with her child. Like, she interacts with children a lot, so you can see like she has maternal instincts and stuff like that. But I almost felt like she was a little bit apathetic towards her child. I was kind of surprised. I didn't feel like they were bonding. I was shocked by that. So what was that important to you? Obviously, besides like that, is like giving her more incentive to like sign reg and stuff like that. But besides that.
Well, I guess, you know, I didn't want it to be that sort of story, you know, and I think the you know, kind of the instinctive move would have been to, yeah, she's protecting her baby and da da da, but again, we're not really in her head in the book. You know, the book is told by this other plural narrator who is really almost speculating about what she's thinking, you know, and so I didn't think that, and I don't think that they were that interested in the baby. They were more interested in her quest to move out into this strange landscape and to discover it for them. And so I didn't want to end with, you know, the sort of typical thing where this happens and this happens, you know, that, you know, all Victorian novels of death or marriage or something. I didn't want to do that, and, or a birth, and so yeah. So I guess it wasn't an interest of mine via this narrating. Yeah. Whoever can go. I don't know.
I have actually,
Oh,
if
you-
I can just ask you a question off of that using my all powerful microphone skill. But actually, I had a question about you. Just like I haven't read a lot of books set in the first person plural, and I thought that was a really interesting choice that struck me almost right off the bat. And I was wondering, you know, what do you feel were like the challenges or limitations of that, and why did you decide to go that route as opposed to another way?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mentioned before that my initial interest in the book was about this community. And of course I could have easily chosen to have one member of the community tell the community story, fan or friend of fans or someone else. But I really did feel as if this community, because of its origins as I had conceived it, was a community that wanted to explore these questions collectively. And you know, my other novels, of course, talk about communities, but again, it's one very, very singular, very particular consciousness within that, and that's how I wanted to present it. But in this book, I really did want to explore and project a collective consciousness, but one of the challenges of that is, you know, you don't want a perspective that feels too rigid or that constantly repeats itself, you know, that has you know, maybe one note, you know, a moralizing note or a certain kind of, you know, like a maybe a more traditional choral, you know, kind of body might have. So what I found was, for me to be interested in this plural we, that this we would be quite various in the ways that it would respond to what it was telling, recounting, and maybe even creating in terms of fan story as they quote unquote told it. And that the action of the story, you know, that the real kind of, you know, dynamic of this novel was not just Fan going out into the world, but to see how this we would begin to change or begin to learn or begin to struggle with all the things that both it was seeing and also you know, what was happening at home. And so that was one of the struggles for me. But I felt early on that I had to really give that voice flexibility so that it wouldn't just be, you know, just this monolithic thing. And I became quite interested in it as I began to write it. I didn't know that I would. I was afraid about using the voice, but once I started to play with it and to have it very flexible, very plastic in a way, I guess I felt like that was right. Oh, I'm sorry, you have the microphone. You have to have a microphone, I guess.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to follow up on something you were saying about how each of your books at one point were ready to give up on it. So what sort of pulled you out of that? Was it a faith in your own talent or your own wisdom about humanity or desire to create a body of work, or how did you know, pass it?
It's really hard to say. None of those that you mentioned. It's you know, I guess it's one of those things where there's a point at which everything feels wrong. You know, the long distance running analogy, you're in real pain and you don't feel like you have no fuel left and you don't have any creativity, it feels dead, you feel distant from it, or it feels like it's gone way wrong, you know, that it's gone in a direction that, and I think the only thing that saved me each time was I just kept going back to it and just sat there. I mean, I really just sat there and didn't give in to those demons, because I think they're always there, and it's so easy to give in to those demons, I think. But maybe it is, maybe as I've grown older and publish more books. Maybe I do have a little bit more faith than I did at the start that maybe somehow I'll find a way. Because it's sort of like spelunking. You know, you're going down and you don't really know the contour and the paths of this cave, you know, and you could get trapped. But I guess you have faith in the idea that maybe this indication, this sort of structure means that, you know, 7 times out of 10 you're not going to get trapped. So that gives you a little faith. So it's probably a combination of those two things, and then just self-preservation. You know, I mean, you know, it feels like if you give up on things, you're gonna die. You know, it almost feels that way. So. Yeah.
Okay, I got the mic now.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for coming to Beijing, and yeah, you did come on a day when you needed a mask, so. Sorry that you didn't come on one of the recent good weather days. But me, what really, like when I was reading the book, what really struck me was there was a certain point where the story just turned for me and I became invested. And that was, spoiler for anyone who hasn't read it, when the Joe character, the boy, drowns, and then there's the funeral scene. Because that just rang so true for me in my experience of you know, Chinese funerals. It was like, wow, you know, did you go to one? And that was, for me, I was like, it got me really curious, like how much of, is it a question of like, how much do you really know about like Chinese culture, or is it like overlap with your understanding of Korean culture? So my question is, what is it about, you know, your, you know, what is it about Chinese culture that stands out from Korean culture or American culture that's distinctive for you, you know, as opposed to its obvious thing? It was like, oh, there's the sense of scale. Like, what is something inherent besides, you know, the obvious differences that everybody knows about? If there is anything.
Yeah, I don't know that there is. I mean, you know, there is a little, you know, it just bleeds over from Korean, you know, funerals, I suppose, and I'd seen Chinese ones on film. But you know, that scene, in people, I think my editor is like, wow, you're really going into all this business about, you know, it's not really, you know, why are you going into this scene? And I really, I had a hard time explaining it to her, because I felt like that scene, and I'm really glad you brought it up. That scene is, I think it was important to me because it's when the community comes together and really kind of taps into a feeling. And it's the first time that Fan really notices that and feels like there's been a real, I suppose, bonding, even with all these disparate people who don't really actually care a lot about each other, that this one moment is sort of crystallizing a feeling. And part of my anxiety about this community that I was writing about was that they've gotten a little bit soft, a little bit comfortable, a little bit, in some ways, detached from one another, because the bonds of their community were so structurally sound and structurally kind of prescribed that they'd forgotten about it. You know, when everyone's a cousin, you know, everyone's a cousin. No one's like right there, you know. And so that was something that I felt that she would see or feel, and so again, not just her, it's the we, right? They begin to feel something, that there's this final first, you know, maybe for the first time in a long time, this rush or this, you know, this drug of feeling, and I guess that's why, you know, that's why that scene exists. So I'm sorry I can't really answer your question, but
That's fine.
yeah, but that's sort of how I thought of it.
I have a question. I have the mic. Much like Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, you decided to name your dystopian novel after a Shakespearean quote. And I was just wondering if you could comment on why you decided to do that.
Well, that was an accident, actually. I was I had written most of the book, and I really had no idea what to call it. It was like the Tale of Fan or something. Just something very ordinary. And I was having such trouble, and I didn't want to put Fan forward first. She's obviously the heroine of the story, but it's sort of not about her in a weird way. And so I was on a plane, and I'd been getting into the habit of taking a Shakespeare play with me on certain plane rides, like 2 and 3 hour plane ride. It's like a perfect little performance, and I didn't read it, as almost as literature. I would read it like a that it would be a performance, just a fun thing that you do, and just and I went back, those little tiny signet Shakespeares that they have, and I went back to my pile and I picked out Julius Caesar, and I brought it with me on the plane, and I got to that famous speech, and where he talks about taking advantage of a certain kind of dangerous opportunity, a dangerous moment, and I felt as if, because he uses water metaphors in that selection, and I felt as if it just fit for not just Fan in the story, but for the whole society. That this was a moment that was fraught, but perhaps the one that would be pivotal for the way that, not to change the society, but the way that these people, we would think about themselves in the society. And that there's all this water stuff in the book with Fan as a diver and aquariums and all that kind of stuff. So I thought that would fit too. And of course William Shakespeare has a way with words. So I just like the sound of it, and the sense of being on such a full sea, which is, again, it's not absolutely clear whether that's a great thing or not a great thing. So I thought that was perfect. Shakespeare has really written about every possible human experience. He's just embedded in the language, which is why he's the greatest. Yeah, that's one right.
American writers to come out and recognize. And I wonder if you feel like, at that time, how much you've sort of seen that change? Is it so different now? Is it possible to go out and do a book and not as sort of be pigeonholed as the Asian American writer? Do you think it's become a much more involved scene for writers of Asian descent who are just writing fiction, and they see it as that, and they don't want to be sort of labeled in that way? What do you think has happened in terms of?
Well, I think what's happened in the literature is that people are writing about all sorts of all sorts of things, and in different ways. So that the modality and tradition isn't just, I'm going to talk about my family and where they're from and our troubles intergenerationally, and give you some little spice here, some flavor, or that kind of stuff. Not that stuff was bad, it's just, it gets old after a while, right? And so I see a lot of younger Asian American writers writing all sorts of stuff, like Victorian kind of novels. Charles Yu has an interesting body of work. I don't know if you know his work, but science fictional, speculative, but very distinctive. You have in Korean American writers, writers like Susan Choi, who write about everything, and all different kinds of characters. And I think that's healthy, and that's the way that, of course, it would naturally evolve. We're, especially in America, we're still a fairly young community, in certain ways, in terms of, I guess, a broad-based immigration from lots of different, national cultures. So I think you'll just see as the new generation of writers matures, you'll just see it'll become like, you know, I suppose Jewish writers. We don't really think of them as Jewish writers anymore. Right? They were in the 50s and 60s as Jewish writers, but we don't really think about them that way. And that's better that way. You know, not that our stories are always going to be immediately known and given. It's just the way that we write about them assumes that we don't have to explain as much as we used to. And I think that's good. I think that's really good. Because that's where, you know, it's always about struggling against the context, right? I mean, the context doesn't recognize us, so we have to explain to the context how to read us. But once that matures, once that process goes along a certain way, then we don't have to do that work of explaining context ourselves to the context. And we can just follow right from the start. A young writer can follow right from the start just his or her weird obsessions, which is what art is, right? And that's what we really want. It's not that our material is bereft of cultural signifiers. I hope not, because that's, you know, people are people. And I always say, I'm an Asian American person. I'm a Korean American person. I mean, I can't escape that. I don't want to. But that's not everything that I think about. I'm thinking about other things, the way that I perceive language, the way that I perceive politics, the environment, all these other things that don't necessarily have to come into, you know, that I need to, you know, explain in the ways that maybe 3 generations ago people felt that they needed to explain, just because the context would never even begin to recognize them.
Most of your audience are Tea Party members, they used to have a lot of explaining.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to Beijing. May I ask, what did you think of your Pulitzer Prize or nominated novel? Was it what did you think, or is there a different book or a different passage or chapter even where you thought, wow, I've nailed this. I've really reached beyond what where would it be?
I don't want to be modest.
I'll go for it. We can take it all here in Beijing, yeah.
No, you know, you're not really that sure about anything. I mean, you do sometimes, you know, sometimes I'll write something and I'll read it back and it just feels like it works, and it feels like I get a little tingle. It feels like, you know, I'm not sitting there going, whoa, you know, really, because you worked it too much to ever have that feeling again. But maybe you read it over and it does still feel fresh to you a little bit, even though you've read it literally 350 times. And that's what I do. That's my process. Is I just keep rereading and rereading and rereading and trying to get the sense of the flow and what I'm talking about. All, you know, you got to keep so many things in mind, right? Not just who's talking, where they are, you know, all the physical stuff, but you know, the sense of, you know, the tropes that you've maybe been suggesting, you know, the kind of movement or pacing, all those kinds of things. So you're reading all the time, and often it can just seem dead to you. You know, or sort of just bland. But sometimes you'll read something and you'll still, even though you've read it so many times, you'll still kind of become a little engaged with it, like, you know, just follow it without sort of helplessly follow it. And I think those are the points at which I think probably I did really good work. Because I still kind of like, oh, I just kind of, you know, you can't help but look at it. And maybe that's what more experienced writers begin to learn about them, or about their work, is that, you know, you have to write towards that. You write towards a thing where you just can't help but stay there. Not that it's great, you just can't help but stay there.
Can I jump in with a question it's about writing about a future world, and it seems like in this novel, and in general, novels about set in the future, like there's a lot of surprises on every page because the writer reveals details as the novel goes along about sort of a somewhat skewed version of our world. So how do you sort of spread out that sort of revelation of information about the world in a novel like this?
Well, I got onto the idea that this would be kind of an adventure quest novel, so that each episode would be a new window onto another slice of this society, you know, another little micro culture or community, and with the little micro culture or community comes a whole set of, you know, morals, assumptions, you know, all the kinds of things that cultures have, and so each chapter, I really didn't know what she was going to encounter, and that was scary at the start. But then I kind of tried to embrace it, because I felt as if maybe that would help and inform the writing, where I was just kind of seeing, you know, what kind of weird creatures literally would Fan encounter, and what would they want from her, and really put myself in her position. Which is just kind of open-eyed, a little wary, but really attentive to what, you know, what weird stuff might be happening. And then once I, you know, say found a particular kind of person, say in the charter village or in the elite village, and I figured out what they wanted from Fan, then of course their whole background begins to be suggested about what they assumed, and what kind of conduct or behavior or morals they had, and what they held as valuable. And that stuff you can't figure out almost beforehand. You have to kind of see the moment, and then kind of reverse engineer it. You know, to reverse engineer the context.
That's interesting, because I think as a reader, you get the sense that the author has mapped out the world beforehand.
Yeah, no, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I knew that the world would be strange, but I didn't know how, you know, in the ways in which it would be strange, chapter by chapter. And that was fun for me. I mean, I did have a lot of fun writing this one, more so than I would say than any of my other novels. Just because I was maybe had a little bit more faith than I did in the other novels, and felt, okay, I can take a chance here, I can just turn the corner, and, you know, because we all live in such a GPS guided world, right? And I really felt like I wanted to turn it off and just go and see what happens.
When you were writing about this world, did you talk at all to your former student Gary Steingart about, so he had written one novel that was set in also like a alternate universe type of thing, or future reality?
Yeah, I love that book, but we never talk about books. We just drink vodka. We had dinner the other night in New York, and it was great. We just eat and drink. That's what we do. So that's what I do with most writers.
Oh yeah, okay, I just have like one more question about this book, because I was wondering, like, you said that like you based like the Chinese people who moved into Bmore off of like the factory workers you met, and I was wondering, like, when they came there, I mean, obviously this is like kind of like stuff in history happens like this, but I was wondering how come they had to like clear out all the folks who were living there already in order to create like their new society?
Well, that was my little, I guess, I'm glad you mentioned it, nod to, you know, what happens to all sort of, you know, local peoples, especially in light of, you know, immigration. You know, and there have been a lot of course, tension between Asian immigrants coming into certain communities in America, and I've written about that before. And Baltimore, you know, and those sections are traditionally African American communities, and there's definitely a sense, as I write it, that this new Asian community is very quick to forget and not want to deal with those people, which is, you know, something that I don't get into deeply, but I definitely wanted to address it, you know, and address the racism about, you know, how certain people have certain kind of, you know, mixed blood, you know, that there was some kind of miscegenation, you know, going on, and there's a, you know, uncomfortable tension between, you know, not the two communities, because there aren't two communities anymore, but uncomfortable tension between what they are and what they think, what they want to believe about their history. That it's easy, we just came here and we fix things. But of course that's not the case, right? There are legacies there that will never go away. And that's something that I want to know.
We're not talking